Так, друзья, давайте, наверное, я перейду уже к техническим вопросам. Вижу, что основная часть к нам гостей пришла. Еще раз всем добрый вечер. И начнем как раз с самой волнующей технической особенности, это переводом. Смотрите, внизу у вас есть значок глобуса, нужно нажать на него. Он может также скрываться под значком 3 точек, да, если у вас свернутая версия зума. И там необходимо выбрать звуковую дорожку. Либо русскую, либо английскую. Если вы выбираете русскую, то есть перевод, также можно поставить галочку напротив фразы про «выключить оригинальный звук». Тогда вам будет слышно только русский перевод, и вот этого закадрового английского звука не будет. Вот, слушайте, как вам удобно. Перевод мы постараемся прислать на 2 языках. Также инструкция была в письме про начало вебинара, то есть везде это можно еще раз перечитать, если у вас вдруг что-то не получается. Про перевод сказала, выбрать его нужно обязательно, иначе звука не будет корректного. Так, если у всех пока получается. Угу. Так, все, тогда другие орг-вопросы. Так, смотрите, наша встреча пройдет примерно за 1,5 часа. Час — это основное интервью, которое будет делать Дарья, и еще полчаса будет уделено на вопросы из чата. Вы можете писать их в чат или можете писать их в рубрику «Вопросы и ответы». Это вот отдельная кнопка в Zoom. Вот, запись, как я сказала, мы пришлем примерно через пару дней, когда обработаем и зальем ее на наш YouTube. Всем, кто подписывался на лендинге, она придет автоматически после загрузки. Вот. Все вопросы, которые у вас есть, пишите, пожалуйста, в чат. Если он технический, то я вам на него помогу и отвечу. Если он по теме лекции, то в конце Дарья выберет вопросы, и все, что успеет, мы зададим за наше определенное время. Кажется, технические вопросы все. Всем еще раз добрый вечер. Очень рада видеть вас на нашем вебинаре сегодня с доктором Сарой Хилл, автором книги «Вы и ваши гормоны». Сара Хилл — это доктор наук и ведущий исследователь эволюционной психологии, и также автор книги. И интервью у нее будет брать Дарья Шипачева, научный журналист и внештатный редактор Forbes Life и Forbes Woman, и еще ряда изданий о здоровье и психологии. Готова передать им слово. Всем спасибо. Мы начинаем. Передаю.
Hello, everybody. So I'll be jump starting to asking you, Sarah, a few questions about sex, of course, because we're talking about sex hormones. So everything sex related is relevant here. So I've seen some research that says that pills, hormonal pills that women take can affect their libido, and usually in a bad way, so their libido drops. But I've seen this number that only 2% of women say that their sex life overall has become worse after taking the hormonal pill. Is your research in line with what I've said?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. A lot of women do report that they experience sexual side effects on the birth control pill. And a lot of times those sexual side effects take the form of reduced libido. What actually happens when you take hormonal contraception is your body increases production of what's known as sex hormone binding globulins. And this actually sucks up the testosterone in your body and makes it unusable. And so what happens is for a lot of women, especially women whose libidos are really sensitive to changes in testosterone, and there seems to be some differences among women in the degree to which it is, you have less available testosterone, and so that tends to minimize sexual desire. And the other thing that of course happens, and this is part of the mechanism by which birth control works, is that it suppresses the peri-ovulatory estrogen surge. And in women, this is the other key ingredient to sexual desire is estrogen. And so we know from decades of research that that at times in the cycle when estrogen is high, that women experience an increase in sexual desire. They have more sex, and so not having this, so suppressing estrogen levels in this way and keeping them very low, in addition to making women's levels of testosterone that's available for their bodies to use lower, can have the effect of minimizing sex drive or decreasing sex drive, or sometimes just killing it altogether. And so in terms of like what women report in some, studies showing that the level or the sort of percentage of women who experience this side effect is as low as something like 2%. There is, there's a lot of research that seems to find that it varies very much depending on the woman, and then also depending on the type of hormonal contraception she's on. So for example, the research seems to indicate that fourth generation progestins, so pills that contain these like Yaz and Yasmin, tend to have fewer sexual side effects than some of the like second and even third generation progestins. And so, we need a lot more research into this to better be able to make better recommendations for women about which one of these pills, like which type of pill is going to work best in terms of sort of allowing healthy libido. But it undoubtedly varies depending on the woman and depending on the prescription.
Yeah, I've seen some research that says that birth control pills that have less estrogen and more progesterone tend to have lower impact on libido. And it's counterintuitive because in your book you're saying that high levels of progesterone is the thing that affects libido the most. So how can you comment these findings?
Right. No, and so I am not familiar with the work that you cited at the beginning about the kinds of pills that tend to be associated with a minimal sexual side effects, being those that are only have progestins or have higher levels of progestins relative to estrogens. And so I'd need to know exactly, I'd be really curious to see like what the ratios of those things are. And the type of progestin that's used, because there are some progestins that are anti-androgenic, right? And so we know that these ones tend to be really not great for sex drive because they not only do they, suppress estrogen and they mop up, or make unavailable women's own levels of testosterone, but then they're also anti-testosterone, and so those tend to be really bad, and some other ones are less bad. And so I need to see that research.
Okay, I'll make sure to share the link with you.
Yeah.
So what would you recommend to women? Because we know that hormonal contraception is highly effective if taken correctly, but some women have experienced very high drop in libido in the past, maybe when they were taking like second or third generation pills, and now they are afraid to use hormonal contraception overall, including the IUD and the implant. So what can you recommend these women?
I recommend troubleshooting. So trying some different types before you just totally throw your hands up in the air. There's almost 100 different formulations of hormonal birth control that are out there, just, in terms of varying the levels of estrogen and progestins and the type of progestins and the delivery method. So whether it's an intrauterine device or an IUD or an implant, and people seem to respond very differently to different types of pills and even different types of delivery mechanisms. So some people respond really well to the IUD, but don't respond well to the exact same hormones when they're delivered in a pill, and vice versa. And so my recommendation is that women work with their physician or work with their doctor to experiment and try to see what's working for them, and then to use a journal, keeping a journal to keep track of how they're feeling on the different types of things that they try, and really try to troubleshoot. It's a very difficult and challenging process. It's not fun for women. And a good reason for this is just there hasn't been enough research on the stuff, and so we don't yet know what's going to work for whom. But don't give up too easily, because I think that a lot of women can find that hormonal birth control can be a really effective tool for avoiding pregnancy during times in the life, you know, when you don't want to get pregnant.
Yeah, totally agree with that, because I've been using the pill for 7 years and now I'm on the hormonal IUD. Both have been working really great, but I can attest to the fact that the hormonal IUD seems to have lower impact on the libido, on the sex drive, and so on. So, concerning sex drive, and some people now are saying that this is the thing that doesn't really exist. Like Emily Nagoski, in her book Come As You Are, she's talking about the accelerator and the brake that are affecting your desire to have sex. And those two things are very contextual. So, for example, stress hits your brakes, and for example, high levels of intimacy with your partner can hit the accelerator. So how can you explain these two processes from the neurobiological standpoint?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So like neurobiologically, what goes on, for example, in the context of stress, is that the physiological processes that go on that cause the stress response actually shut down the part of the body or the brain that facilitates sexual desire and sexual response. And so you actually get that these things are antagonistic, and so they actually work against one another. And women's sexual desire is very much contextual, like you talked about. And it's not just a simple matter of, is there something, you know, is there somebody here who I can have sex with, right? Which is generally like men's sexual desire works a little bit more in that way. Like, is there an attractive person around? And then, you know, they'll go and have sex with that person. And for women, there's a lot more sort of like really, you know, sort of contextual cues. And a lot of the reason for this is that, you know, evolutionarily, because women are the ones who have to maintain a pregnancy, and they are the ones who bear the larger cost associated with reproduction, our brains are just wired to be very cued in to, you know, like, is this somebody that I like really love? Does this person love me? Do they care about me? Am I in a situation where I feel comfortable and relaxed and not stressed out? Is this the type of environment that would be okay for having a baby? And all of these things go on unconsciously, even in the context of birth control, where like consciously we know we're not going to get pregnant from the act of sex, but our brain is running this program that we've inherited from our ancestors who didn't have access to birth control. And so our sexual psychology and our sexual response even is very much tied in to all of these different cues that historically would have played a role in determining the success of the relationship and then any children that might result from it.
So is there a way to hack this program somehow? So for example, if a woman feels a low level of sexual desire, but she really wants to make it higher, what can she do?
I mean, I think for that, you know, there's a lot of different types of hacks, right? You can do relationship hacks, which will be things where you know, work to do things to build the quality of the relationship with the partner that you have, because that we know for women is associated with increased feelings of intimacy and increased sexual desire. But I mean, you can also just have physical hacks. And what, you know, and this is actually something that I know that Emily Nagoski touches on in her book, Come As You Are, that you referenced. But just this idea that, you know, women's bodies, even if like our brain is like, I'm stressed out and I'm going a million miles an hour and I don't know what to do, if you actually get into a sexual contact, like a context, a consensual sexual context that a woman wants to be in, and she's, you know, experiencing physical sensations, you can also get things going that way. And so even when your brain is like not quite there, sometimes you can get your body where it needs to be, and your brain will catch up and get into that space.
Yeah, and also Nagoski has written about spontaneous desire and responsive desire, and also the fact that desire and arousal are kind of different things. So can you comment on that from the neurobiological perspective as well?
Right. So the difference between desire and what was the
Arousal.
and arousal. Yeah. So I mean, we can experience sexual arousal in times where we don't actually want to have sex. So like we're having low desire, but high arousal. And then we can also have times where we're really desiring sex, and physiologically our body isn't responding in a way that's consistent with sort of sexual arousal. And especially for women, I think that this is a really important thing to understand, is that the two things aren't synonymous with one another, because I think that women oftentimes will beat themselves up, or their partners will think that they're not sexually attracted to them if they're not having both responses simultaneously. And it's just a lot more complicated for women. And these are distinct processes, and sometimes they're in line and sometimes they're discordant. And if you have, discordant arousal and desire, it doesn't make either one, like one thing isn't better than the other. And the two things aren't always going to work together. And I think that we should learn to embrace both of these things and be able to understand that the quality of the relationship and the quality of a sexual relationship, doesn't necessarily always mean that you're going to have both of these things at the same time. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, so for example, if you're aroused but you don't have sexual desire, you can just masturbate. Mm-hmm. And if you have desire but you don't have arousal, you can ask your partner to touch you in some sensual way in order to increase your desire. Is that correct?
Right, or use a lubricant.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about spontaneous and responsive desire? What is the biological difference here?
Well, I mean, spontaneous desire is where you are, and this is the thing that we know is linked a lot with estrogen. And this is just like where you're, doing the laundry or vacuuming, and you're just like, kind of think like, wow, you know what I'd like to do right now? It's not vacuuming. And that's where you sort of spontaneously have this moment of, thinking about sex and having sort of, fantasizing about that and wanting sex in that way. And men have a lot of this. Like, so men have like this kind of spontaneous desire all the time. And I think that sometimes men think that their partners should also be having this all of the time. But women, we do have some of that, especially right near the periovulatory phase of the cycle. So right mid-cycle, women tend to get a lot more of this type of desire than they do at other points in the cycle. Responsive desire is where you're doing laundry and thinking about doing laundry, and your partner wants to have sex and is kind of, setting a stage, and you also want to do it, but you're not like really feeling desirous. It's not like you're spontaneously like wanting to do it, but your body will still respond. And again, and women tend to have a lot more of this type of desire than men do. And we especially tend to have a lot of this type of desire near the second half of the cycle, when progesterone is dominant and after estrogen levels have started to fall. Again, this is one of these things where I think that women have this false narrative in their mind about what is, what they should be experiencing, and how it should always just be this, feeling of spontaneous desire. But that's not, we don't always work that way. And most of the time we don't work that way. And it's not any less valid than any of the other types of sexual responses.
Yeah, and according to what you've said, I'd assume that women who are on the birth control pill will have more responsive desire than spontaneous desire, and it's okay, and you can just accept that as a fact.
Yeah, and just also understand that it's temporary. It's like that's, it's your medication, and it's okay, but you also don't need to feel like you need to identify with it.
Yeah. Speaking about identifying with something, I'd like to talk about asexual people a little bit, because asexual people sometimes say that they do have arousal, they do have libido, but they don't experience attraction. And it sounds really complicated for me. and I would like to understand how it might work on the biological level.
That's an amazing question, and it's one I wish I had an answer to, and I don't. But I find the whole thing I find it fascinating. And I'm not exactly sure, like, what, you know, my hunch is that there's, I mean, obviously there's some things going on, you know, in the brain, because that's where everything happens. That's where all the magic happens. But I think there's probably a hormonal component to it, because, like, one thing that's really interesting about the birth control pill is that in some ways it really gives us a window into the way that hormones influence our psychology, right? Because we get all of these changes that we get from just taking this pill that's changing our hormonal profile. And it really can do things like lead people to feel asexual. So, you know, when people are experiencing no sexual desire at all, which some women do report on the pill. They report that they just, like, you know, if sex was a thing, if sex was a thing that just went away, you know, they'd have no problem with it at all. Or they don't feel like they need to have these, like, close relationships in the way that they felt that they had to. And I've also spoken with women. And what's really interesting about this is that I've heard it both ways, where I've heard from women who were who considered themselves to be obligate lesbians. So women who were lesbians and didn't have any attraction to male partners start the birth control pill and start finding themselves attracted to men. But I've also had women who are heterosexual obligatorily, and then they started birth control and they found themselves being attracted to women. And so what all of this shows is that, you know, and obviously this doesn't happen for everybody. These are rare cases, but they're giving us a window into the contribution of sex hormones in determining things like sexual attraction, you know, and whether that means, like, who you're attracted to, or even if you're attracted to anybody.
Yeah.
You know, I think that it gives us a keen insight into that, and it tells us that there is hormonal involvement, and that it's going to be really nuanced and is going to be interacting with a whole lot of other things going on psychologically. But my guess is that yes, there's hormonal involvement, but no, I don't know what it is. I wish I did.
Because I've heard a story of a transgender person who was born female, and she identified as asexual. She had really low libido and no attraction at all. But then she started taking testosterone, and then her levels of libido increased, and she even started to experience some attraction. So hormones are really powerful.
Yeah, they're super powerful. Yeah, that's fascinating. And that's another sort of natural experiment, is looking at male to female transsexuals and male to female, or male to female, female to male, and looking at the different types of psychological changes that go on. And it's really profound in some cases, the types of changes that people report experiencing in response to those hormonal changes.
Yeah, so the thing I wanted to say is that if you feel asexual and it's okay with you, then you can just leave it as it is. But if you think that you would like to get your libido back, maybe you could consider some hormonal therapy with your doctor.
Yeah, no, I think I think that's wise advice.
Yeah. So I would like to elaborate further on attraction, attractiveness, because in your book you're talking about the impact that the hormonal pill has on the types of people you are attracted to. So, for example, heterosexual women on the pill tend to find less masculine men more attractive than women that don't take the pill. So what are the other findings that you've got on this topic?
Yeah, no, so this is a really fascinating line of research, and it's one that can obviously have really big consequences for women's relationships. And essentially, it's exactly what you said. It's that, you know, there's been research now for several decades showing that at times in the cycle when estrogen is high, so this is women who are not on the pill, so naturally cycling women, that the estrogen surge is linked with an increased preference for cues of masculinity, so things like testosterone and deep voices and that sort of thing. And so researchers have since looked at what happens when you suppress all of that and put women on the birth control pill. And women on the pill do have a preference for less masculine male faces, voices, and instead they tend to be prioritizing other traits. So they seem to be prioritizing, at least based on some research, things like financial provisioning ability, and and things that are associated with like relationship stability, right? So women tend to go after like like safer, like good dad types of guys when they're on hormonal contraception. And then, you know, and what this means, you know, this means a few things. One, it can change the types of partners that women are choosing, which, you know, could be, you know, impacting things like the divorce rate. And some research seems to indicate that women who choose their partners when they are on the pill tend to have a lower divorce rate. Maybe because they're choosing these like Mr. Stable, you know, good dad, provisioning ability guy instead of this like sexy Lothario, which tends to get sort of prioritized when estrogen's high. Other research indicates that you might get problems in relationships that occur if you were on the pill and like choose a partner and then go off of it. Or, you know, if you choose your partner when you're off the pill and then you go on it. And so having this like discordance in your hormonal profile based on what your profile was when you chose your partner and then maintaining the relationship, I mean, it suggests that it can cause some issues, and that if women choose their partners when they're on the pill and then they go off it, that can decrease their attraction to their partner. And the reverse is also true. It seems like the research seems to indicate that women who choose their partners when they were off the pill and then they go on it, they also experience a diminished attraction to their partner.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Don't really understand what you can do about it, but at least maybe not divorce right away and maybe try to find some counseling.
Yeah, try to find some counseling, I think, is a really good recommendation. I also think that that it's like if a lot of these things, what the research is really indicating, like when you look at all of it together and sort of the gestalt of all of it, is that it's all very nuanced. And all of these things, all of these hormonal effects that we get from the pill, very much like differ depending on the specific context. And it's not just your biological context, but also the relationship context. So there's been some research that seems to suggest that whether or not women experience these big shifts in attraction to their partner, depending on whether they change their hormonal contraceptive status, depends on the quality of the relationship, right? And if you're in a high quality, really like good relationship, that these things tend to be less of a problem. They're less likely to happen. And so
your body will just adapt to the change.
Yes, exactly. And so, you know, so I think that everybody should take heart and understand that like working on the relationship and the quality of the pair bond is something that it's not like you have no control over that. Though that is something that you have some control over.
So we know that hormonal contraception is really effective, but in some cases women just decide not to take the pill or not to have the IUD, or maybe she takes the pill but sometimes she forgets, and then she has a risk of getting pregnant. And we have this morning after pill, but I was really shocked when I read the book called Viva la Vagina, and the authors there said that this morning after pill really has very, very limited effectiveness because it's effective only around ovulation. So naturally, even if you had sex, unprotected sex, your risks of getting pregnant from this one occasion are really low. So you wouldn't get pregnant anyway in 90% of the cases. And if you take the morning after pill, you have 95% effectiveness. So you get only 5 percentage points of increased efficacy. So do you think that it's really necessary to take this morning after pill, considering all of the side effects? And if so, when during the cycle should a woman consider taking it?
That's a really great question, and I think that you're smart and right to sort of bring up this idea that the morning after pill in a lot of ways requires that you have some basic understanding of your cycle and the way that fertility works, or else you're buying a lot of morning after pills that you don't need. So our bodies, there's only about 5 or 6 days across the cycle where sex can occur, and then that sex could potentially lead to a pregnancy. And that's the 5 or so. It's usually about 5 days prior to ovulation, and then within 12 to 24 hours of ovulating. So that's the only window. It's called the peri-ovulatory and ovulatory window. So 5 days prior to ovulation, and then 24 hours after ovulation, and that's it. And so if you understand when those days are in your cycle, those are the days to take the morning after pill if you had unprotected sex and are hoping to avoid pregnancy. Otherwise, at other points in the cycle, you don't need to take it because you can't get pregnant anyway. And so I think that, even basic cycle tracking is really something that's worthwhile for women, where you use something like the fertility tracker on your phone. A lot of these apps are out there, there's some that are really good, where you can have really precise cycle tracking based on things like basal body temperature. So I would recommend that in conjunction with the morning after pill, because taking a morning after pill on day 18 of your cycle is just totally unnecessary.
Yeah, and if you know your cycle and you know that you ovulate all the time on the 14th day, for example, you will know whether or not it's necessary to take this pill and have all the side effects and spend all that money.
Right, exactly. And do you think that the people who sell that are telling people that? No.
Of course not. That's why I'm telling this.
Right, exactly. I love it.
Yeah. So let's talk about hormones in our everyday life and social life. First, many people say that women tend to be whimsical or capricious because of their menstrual cycles, and I've heard your TED talk where you said that that's not true, because our cycles are predictable and we always know when something will change, and we're adapted to respond to these changes. And men, on the other hand, they have spontaneous surges of testosterone sometimes that are unpredictable. So if someone is capricious, it's men. So do men have some kind of cycles such as women? And who's more whimsical?
Yeah, no, it's definitely men are more whimsical than women. So women, we tend to, as you noted, we've been labeled as being capricious and whimsical, and that our hormones, change on a dime. And so you never know what you're going to get when you talk to women, because their hormones are going crazy. But our hormones change in very predictable ways, and it's consistent from cycle to cycle. So if you, as I say in my TED talk, if you give me a woman's age and the day of her, the first day of her last menstrual cycle, I'll be able to tell you with almost alarming accuracy what her sex hormones look like at that moment. And the same is not true for men. So men's primary sex hormone, which, as we all know, is testosterone, changes not in a cyclical way where we can make predictions about it just based on something like how old are you and when did you have your last period. But instead, for men, we know that testosterone changes in response to age, like women's, but it also changes in response to the time of day, whether or not a man is in a relationship, whether or not a man has children, whether or not he sees a beautiful woman, whether or not his favorite sports team wins or loses, whether or not his favorite political candidate wins or loses, whether he sees a gun, like all of these things change men's levels of testosterone, right? And men's testosterone, when that changes, it changes their men's behavior, just like women's hormones change women's behavior. And so for men, these changes are a lot more unpredictable than they are for women. So, you know, even though women get the sort of, there's a stereotype that we are unpredictable because of our hormones. It's absolutely not true. And if anybody is unpredictable because of their hormonal changes, it would be men, just because there's change so frequently.
And what about testosterone in women? Because it also affects our sex drive and our social life. So when does testosterone tend to change in women?
So women also experience testosterone changes, right? And so we aren't men aren't the only ones who experience changes in testosterone in response to things happening in the environment. Our changes are a lot more subtle. They're much smaller. So instead of being on a scale of like this to this, women's testosterone changes are like this to this. And so it doesn't have these sweeping effects on the way that we respond to things. But a lot of the things that impact men's testosterone also impact women's. So women's sexual desire, for example, is something that increases women's levels of testosterone. Competitive victories. So even if you win at like a board game, and this is true for both men and women, like we'll get an increase in testosterone levels. And so we get changes in testosterone levels that respond to many of the same things that men's do. It's just that ours are like more like this and men's are more like this.
So for example, if a man wants his girlfriend to get more horny, he can play a board game with her and make her win.
I love that. It's like the weirdest foreplay ever.
Yeah. Because of testosterone, it's traditionally assumed that men are like more assertive, more risk-taking, more confident, aggressive, and it helps them build careers and become successful in the social life. But now we understand that maybe a big part of that is due to socialization, but not the hormones. So what can you say about that?
I mean, everything, whenever we're talking about something as complex as human behavior, it's something that's influenced by a variety of different processes. And this includes, things that are hormonal and other things that are operating along different types of mechanisms, right? And so we know that socialization and learning and all of these different things play a role in contributing to men's and women's behaviors and the types of roles that they adopt in society. And, given that we're, incredibly biological creatures, and everything that we do is the result of processes that happens somewhere in our brain. There are some neurobiological, there's some neurobiological things that happen in response to socialization and learning and all these other things that are actually driving the bus in terms of changing behavior. But it's not just going to be just hormonal inputs. No way. Our behavior is way too complex for that.
Yeah, so maybe there is a chance to, for example, if you're a mother and you have a daughter and this daughter wants to perform in competitive sports and she gets this reinforcement, she gets this testosterone, she gets all this, acknowledgement from her coach, and then she becomes more confident, more assertive. And then we see women that play soccer and are even better than men. Because some people say women's soccer, it's something very dull because it's women. They can't compete on men's level. And then you watch the game and you see that it's the same level of competitiveness.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the idea that we're inherently less competitive than men is something that's based on a complete misunderstanding of women's psychology. I think that it's based on, you know, historically psychology as a field and trying to understand our behavior and our motivations and that sort of thing. It used to be a field that was dominated by men, and so men would look at women, right, and see that, you know, we don't get into fist fights, right, and we don't, like, yeah, you know, call each other an asshole all the time, and, you know, and these kinds of things. And so based on that, and a total, not, you know, miscalculation of what's actually going on in our brains and the way that competition even works for women, men concluded that, oh, well, women aren't as competitive as men, you know, because they don't punch each other in the face and call each other assholes. But now that we have more women in psychology, we're actually, like, people are starting to really question these assumptions and to overturn them with data showing that women are just as competitive as men. It's just that the way that it manifests itself tends to be very different. So women compete in different ways than men do. And it's not always about, like, physical aggression.
Yeah, it's more subtle, maybe more intellectual, and in the sphere of, I don't know, emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like emotional warfare.
So I think that maybe if we tend to get more equal gender approach, then we will see that men will get some of the women's ways and women will get some of the men's ways, and it's not all about the hormones.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we're, like I said, human behavior is far too complex to be reduced to any one thing, including hormones.
Yeah, and what do you think about gender dysphoria? Because there has been a lot of talk about it recently, and some people think that it's more biological and hormonal, and others think that it's more about socialization. So again, do you see any leading role of any of these factors, or it's also very complex and interconnected?
Very complex and interconnected is my answer for that one. Yeah, there's not going to be a smoking gun with that. It's far too complex. So we're not going to be able to isolate, oh, well, this is what causes gender dysphoria, or, you know, it's how you were raised, or it's your hormones, or it's your this. It's all of these things work together and create these incredibly complex outcomes that we're just starting to understand.
Yeah, so we just need more research to understand it better and understand the cases when it's necessary to have hormonal therapy, and when maybe it's just better to rethink your idea of social roles.
Right, exactly.
You were talking about the levels of cortisol that get diminished when women take the birth control pill. And at first it sounds like something good because you have lower levels of the stress hormone, and then you should not be stressed at all. But in fact, it leads to worse responses to stress, and you become more stressed, and then you can even develop, for example, anxiety disorder or depression. Can you please understand or explain this in more detail, how it works, and
Yes.
how you can get depressed because of that?
Yeah, so the research that you're alluding to, it finds that women who are on hormonal contraception actually don't experience a surge in the stress hormone cortisol in response to stress. So normally when most people are experiencing a stressful event, within 5 minutes of that event happening, they get a big, huge increase in this stress hormone. And cortisol, the stress hormone, tends to have a bad reputation because people tend to think that it causes stress. But cortisol doesn't cause stress. It's actually part of how our body copes with stress.
Yeah.
And so cortisol is actually necessary to allow us to do things like learn from the stressful experience. So we know that it's associated with birthing of new neurons and filtering things from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. And so essentially allowing us to learn from bad things that happen or important things that are happening. And it also does a bunch of other things that help our bodies cope. And so when we don't experience this increase in stress hormones, when we're stressed out, it actually means that we're less able to cope with stress. And this is obviously not favorable. This is something that because you're, experiencing stressful things and your body isn't able to regulate itself in this context, what it can end up doing is leading people to feel very depressed and anxious, and they should be, because they're not coping with stress. And so their body, starts to experience these changes where it can be, and we know from research now that for some women, the birth control pill can increase their risk of depression and anxiety. And one of the mechanisms by which this is likely happening is this change that we get in the cortisol response. But the cortisol response, not having that change in cortisol response actually suggests that there's some larger issues going on in the body that are associated with too much cortisol signaling. Because essentially when you have somebody having shut down their stress response, it usually indicates that their stress response was going crazy and that the body just shut it down.
Yeah.
And there's some evidence that suggests that this is exactly what happens, and that they don't understand what it is and how it works. But it seems like when you go on the pill, at least some formulations of it, that what happens is your stress response goes into overdrive, and then your body shuts it down. And this can have all kinds of implications for things like not only regulating stress and things like anxiety disorders, but it might also change somebody's risk of things like autoimmunity and other inflammatory disorders, because cortisol, in addition to helping our bodies manage stress, also help our bodies regulate inflammation and inflammatory activity. And so there's some sort of rumblings in the research literature looking at the link between hormonal contraceptive use and autoimmunity, which was something that we know that women get a lot more frequently than men do, and whether or not this isn't exacerbated by these changes in the cortisol response that we see.
Do you think that the fact that women get depression and anxiety disorders more often than men is at least partially connected to the fact that we use hormonal contraception? Because I've seen these numbers that without the pill, your risk of getting depressed during this year is like 8%, and with the pill, it's like 11%. So there is some increase.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that one of the reasons that we see the differences in the rates of depression and anxiety in women compared to men absolutely is owed to the birth control pill.
So can you do something about this stress response that is disrupted if you take birth control pill? For example, I don't know, have some physical activity every time you experience stress.
Right. No, that's a really interesting question. And unfortunately, the research isn't in a place where we really even understand what is going on, like why this happens. And so it's hard to know how to minimize the effects, since it's really difficult to pinpoint exactly like what the progression is and how it's manifesting itself in women's bodies. But I do think that in general, for almost every system of the body, you can never go wrong in terms of doing things like making sure that you're getting enough sleep, making sure that you're getting physical activity, eating a healthy diet that has all of the nutrients that you need. And I think that anything that we can do to support our bodies and support well-being generally are also going to help in this context. Because like I said, the research, when you look at it and like holistically and look at the big picture of everything that the research is showing us, is that people's responses are incredibly variable. And so anything that we can do to like promote well-being and happiness and mental health sort of generally should also play a role in mitigating our likelihood of experiencing these negative effects on the birth control pill.
So what could you advise to women who have already experienced some depressive episodes in the past? maybe making this journal that you talked about already. If they are taking the pill and they notice some changes in their mood, they can go to a therapist, or they can try to change their pill. Is there anything else that they can do?
No, and I really like those. I really like those ideas. I think that it's really important. Depression and anxiety are complicated to identify in your own self, and and the reason for this is that our brain has this tendency to play tricks on us. And if we start feeling anxious or we're feeling depressed, our brain tells itself a story where it believes that it always felt that way, and so it doesn't really feel like there's something wrong with you. You just feel like you're a depressed person.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and so that's why I think keeping a journal is so important, because then you actually have objective evidence of what things used to be like and what things are like now. And that can tell you whether or not there might be something going on that needs to be checked out. And so I definitely recommend keeping a journal, especially if you're not on hormonal contraception and you're about to go on it, or if you're on it and are about to go off of it, or if you're on this type and about to try that type. I think it's really useful to keep track of how your body is responding, so that way you can best find something that's going to allow you to feel maximally happy in, you know, given your life circumstances.
Yeah.
So I think that that's really the key. And then, you know, if you're on something and you're experiencing mental health issues, you know, definitely talk to your doctor about trying something different, and, you know, maybe even trying something else. There's other, you know, non-hormonal alternatives for women who don't respond well to hormones. And so that's also a possibility, is either trying a different brand of the birth control pill or whatever it is that you're on, or trying something else altogether if you're just not responding.
Yeah, so the last question I'm going to ask from myself will be about PMS, of course. Yeah, I've heard this hypothesis that maybe PMS is partially due to some social factors. You think that you should experience PMS, so when you do experience some sudden drop in your hormones, you tend to aggravate all the symptoms that come with it, and you become maybe more vulnerable to those effects. And on the other hand, when you feel happy, for example, you tend to experience less symptoms of PMS. Does your research support this hypothesis?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to PMS, PMS is something that seems to happen because of a dysregulated response to changing levels of progesterone. And when progesterone gets metabolized in the body, it releases this metabolite called allopregnanolone. And the research right now suggests, and it activates sort of calming neurotransmitters in our brain. But for women who experience PMS, they don't experience that same pattern. Instead, their brains respond in a really funky way to the changing levels of hormones that can lead them to feel angry, to feel anxious, and to feel depressed. And so, you know, for these women, it's one of those things where it's a combination, like you had alluded to, of what's actually happening in your life. Right. So if things are amazing, even if you have PMS, you'll probably experience life being amazing. But, you know, most of the time, you know, 8 times out of 10, life isn't amazing. Right. Like, it's like we have hassles and stressors and kids or friends or boyfriends or whatever it is. Yeah, exactly. Things are like irritating us. And so what PMS does is it takes those little irritants and just like turns them up several notches. And yeah, and this is because of a dysregulated hormone response. And there are things that you can do to balance your hormones naturally that can decrease and diminish the symptoms of PMS. But women who have PMS also benefit from lifestyle modifications that you were saying. Like, if you make your life less stressful and you sort of understand that this is a period in your cycle when you should not be encountering as many stressors and you need to take it easy on yourself, that can help. But the birth control pill actually ends up being very therapeutic to women who are on the birth control, for who have PMS, because since it stabilizes hormones, it prevents all of those changes that these women's brains aren't responding very well to. And so some women actually end up having improved mental health when they're on the birth control pill because of reductions in their PMS symptoms.
But you still can have PMS on the birth control pill.
Yeah, you can. I mean, that's absolutely true. Some women do still experience PMS when they're on the birth control pill.
Because your natural cycles, your natural system maybe is too powerful and it just overpowers the pill or something like
exactly. that. Exactly. Yeah. So for women who experience PMS when they're on the pill, we tend to see that more frequently in women who are on the triphasic kinds, so the kinds that change the levels of hormones. For women who experience PMS or experience PMS when they're on the pill, it's generally recommended that they switch to a monophasic type where it's a constant stream of hormones, and even to be on things where you actually skip the period or the bleed. And so like hormonal IUDs and implants tend to work well for women who get PMS because it keeps things constant. And same with the packs of pills where you do 3 cycles in a row without a withdrawal bleed.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'll go through the questions that we've received and try to pick some of the best ones. Okay. I see some interesting comments, but it's not actually a question, but I think I'll still read it out loud. Prior to taking any pill, the doctor must verify all or at least main hormone levels, and besides, that patient must be evaluated for autoimmune processes. Do you agree with that?
That would be amazing and fantastic if it was true. It's certainly not true here in the US. I don't know how things work over there, but here the birth control pill is generally given for a lot of different things. So it's given to people for pregnancy prevention, it's given to teenagers for clearing up their skin and just like decreasing the number of menstrual cramps that they get, or syndromes like endometriosis. But these generally are prescribed without more than a 10-minute doctor consultation where they ask about their family's history of stroke and heart attack. And then that's it. Like there's generally not any blood work given or anything else. And I think that giving those types of tests, like testing for a prior autoimmunity or testing for existing hormone levels, would be a huge step in helping us identify how women respond to different formulations of the pill based on their own levels of hormones and that sort of thing. But that's currently not being done, but I think it'd be a great step forward.
Yeah, so it's an interesting path of research that could be taken in Russia, because here we have, in general, we have more elaborate research before you get the pill.
Oh, really?
And many people think that they should just get tons of blood work done before you get the pill, and in some cases it's really like that. It depends on your doctor, but sometimes some of my female friends have checked their hormone levels before they got the pill. So yeah, it's a thing that happens here.
I think that's amazing, and I would love to know. I'm like, I need to find a Russian collaborator to get data from, because I would love to be able to get an idea of how that, because it'd be really neat to see whether or not a woman's pre-existing hormone levels influence how she responds to the pill, and whether or not it's a positive or negative event for her.
Yeah. Okay. So here is another question. Ira Mayer says, "Hi everyone, I read the original version of the book, and I think it's the most hilarious, funny, and entertaining nonfiction book I have ever come across. Thank you, Sarah, for this fantastic experience. My question is about the difference between the pill and the implant, such as Nexplanon. From my personal experience of using Nexplanon, I felt that physiological and psychological consequences are quite similar to what you described when writing about the pill. So I wonder if there are any difference here. Also, do you have any research on the long-term consequences of the hormonal implant versus the pill? Thank you."
Okay, no, these are really great questions, and thanks for the kind words. That makes me so happy. Yay! So thank you for that. So in terms of the implant versus the pill, the hormones that are in the implant are the same hormones that are in many of the combination birth control pills that are out there. And given that the hormonal profile that's created by the implant is very similar to that that's created by the birth control pill, we can expect to see that the patterns of side effects, so the actual psychological experiences that people have in response to it, are going to be similar. There's some evidence that indicates that, delivery mode, so whether something is an implant or a pill, does seem to influence some side effects, like some people's side effects, but it's mostly just about like what is actually in them. And so, yes, the experiences that you had that seem to be very similar to things that I wrote about in the book when I was talking about like the pill. When I was talking about the pill in the book, I was just really using that as shorthand for all forms of hormonal contraception. And so, so it is expected that your side effects are going to be very similar to those on most combination birth control pills. So, so yes, very similar. You should absolutely identify with some of the things going on in the book because it's the same processes. In terms of the long-term effects, that's a really great question. And it's not one that I've seen a lot of research on. And it's one that we need more research on. So one thing that has been not studied at all that's important, because we have a lot of these women now are women who've been on the birth control pill for a very long time, right? So I've met women who were on it for 20 years. I've met women who were on it for 25 years. I myself was on it for almost 12 years, and we're on it for these uninterrupted stretches of time. And there's not any research on whether or not changing your hormonal profile and keeping it constant, because you have to remember that women's brains are actually designed in a way that's responding to waxing and waning levels of hormones, right? Because our brains are designed for our natural cycles, right? And so where you get these like changes in estrogen and these changes in progesterone. And so we don't know, like, what is having this constant stream of these two hormones, for 12 years, like, what does that do? Like, are there long-term effects of that? We don't know. We just don't know. There's not any research on that. And this is something that's sorely needed. My hope is that the next like decade of science into these kinds of issues, and we're working on trying to get some of these issues looked at right now in my own research lab, is trying to understand these issues, because there are so many women who are on it for long periods of time, and we just don't know what the outcome is.
Yeah, I've considered Nexplanon, and as far as I know, it's progestin only, like the IUD, and combination pills are progesterone plus estrogen. Is there some significant difference between these two types of hormonal contraception?
Right, really great question. And, so the existence of progestin-only formulations, so things like Nexplanon and the hormonal IUD, they tell you, and this is something that the researchers have known, but what really makes birth control effective is the progestins, right? So the progestins are what turns off the the HPG axis. So that's like what prevents ovulation. And so, birth control really to be effective only needs to have the progestins in it. The estrogens are added because it tends to minimize some of the unpleasant side effects of progestins. And so, so the estrogens in the pill, they do have a few sort of contraceptive properties, like they thicken cervical mucus and do some other things that can sort of minimize the risk of pregnancy. But mostly they're added to offset some of the ways that progestins make people feel, because progestins can be linked with things like I can't never say this word, hirsutism. It's like where you grow facial hair, or you minimizing your sex drive, or gaining weight. Some of these are things that progestins can potentially lead to, and estrogen actually offsets some of these side effects. And so, the main differences seem to be that women generally feel better on combination products, so products that have progestins and estrogen. But the thing that like the implant and the hormonal IUD have going for them is that they're such low levels of progestins that they tend to work really well for some women. And so
they don't need estrogens added to them.
Right. Well, the pills really don't need it either.
Yeah.
They just have it in there because it makes women feel better, but it doesn't have that many contraceptive properties. And the reason that they don't have estrogen in these long-lasting products is because estrogen is the thing in birth control pills that causes the cardiovascular events. So things like heart attacks and strokes, that's the estrogens in the pill. That's not the progestins. And if you have a long-lasting product, if you overload the body with high levels of estrogen, it can really increase your risk of cardiac events. And so that's why those are progestin only.
Okay. I've been going back and forth a lot between the Mirena IUD and the Nexplanon, but I chose Mirena because I've read a lot of research that for the implant, many women experience 6 months or even a year of discharge, this bleeding, not like cycle, but just you bleed and you bleed and you bleed all the time. So I decided that's too much for me. Any maybe meta-analysis that summarize the side effects of the IUD versus Nexplanon?
Yeah, no, I don't know of anything that's like looked at that specifically, but I do know that a lot of because one of the things that estrogen also does in the combination products is it helps to prevent that breakthrough bleeding that you're talking about, the bleeding and bleeding and bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. And what's really interesting is that, and I wish I had an answer for this, but when it comes to these types of products, people tend to have sort of a bimodal response, where some women who are on like the hormonal IUD, like I think that you said, Daria, like you love it, right? And I've met many women who absolutely love it. They feel like themselves. And all of this is 100% valid, right? But then you also have some women who have this like incredibly horrible response to these same things. And I found this to be true more because a lot of times you'll get people who love it and people who hate it, but then a lot of people in the middle who are like, it's okay. But for whatever reason, with these products, with Nexplanon and the hormonal IUD, I only hear these stories.
Yeah,
like,
me too.
Yeah, it's the best thing ever. I love it. I love it. I love it. Or, oh my God, no. It's horrible. So
Yeah.
it was really interesting.
And you never know before you try.
That's true. I mean, and that's the thing. And I'm hoping that one day, the research will get us to a place where we're able to make good predictions ahead of time. So that way women don't have to suffer as much as we do now. But now it's like a game of Russian roulette when we're choosing our contraception and just like, well, let's see what this one does.
Yeah. So I'll look through the questions in the Q&A. Okay. This question I like because it's in line of many of the stereotypes. How long does it take to detox after taking a pill?
Oh, okay. I love that. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. So, this is actually like, it's going to sound like a really complicated answer. So the hormones are actually out of your body, like usually within 24 hours. So like in terms of like just getting the hormones out of your body, 24 hours and you're all set. But there are things like in terms of like getting your body back to normal. There are biological things that happen when you've been on the birth control pill for a long time, even if you start taking it in adulthood. And this is because our brain is really, and this is true for all the cells in our body, by the way, is they adjust the number of receptors that they have for hormones, depending on what the levels of hormones are that are entering the body or that are being released by the body. And so just to give you an example, a study came out recently, and this for people who study the brain, this isn't a surprise, but they found that women who are on the birth control pill for a long, and I don't even know what the average length of use was, but let's say it was 6 months. I think it was a couple of years. But they find that women who are on the pill have a smaller hypothalamus than women who are not on the birth control pill. And that sounds really alarming, right? But what happens is if your brain isn't having to respond in a dynamic way to all these dynamically changing levels of hormones that occurs to a naturally cycling woman, it doesn't need to have as many receptors. And so the receptor density is going to be different. So there's a lot of adjustments that the brain and cells in the body make based on levels of hormones. And so it probably will take a couple of months if you start taking the pill in adulthood, and especially if you're on it for a long period of time. But again, we need more research because we don't know that this is true or not true. That it will probably take you a couple of months for your the receptor density for hormones and all of these things to change in a way that's in tune with your own natural hormones. So sometimes it can take women 6 months even to like even get their cycle back to normal and actually have ovulatory cycles. I mean, it seems to vary tremendously between women. So some women get everything back to normal like really quickly, and some women's bodies take longer to adjust. The only exception the only area that, I'm like, if we're talking about like detoxing in terms of getting your body back to normal, that I really get concerned about is if girls start taking the pill prior to the time their brain is done developing, especially when girls take it like when they're still in the midst of the pubertal transition. So when girls go on it, soon after they start their periods, and even if they go on at any time before they're like 19 or so, your brain is still under a period of rapid development, and your sex hormones play a role in determining that. And so you could actually get developmental changes that occur. And this is where the brain is actually wiring itself differently because of the birth control pill compared to what it would be wired if you were naturally cycling. And we don't know, like there's not a lot of research out there on the long-term effects of pill use during adolescence. And this is something that's sorely needed, especially like in the US. I don't know how it is in Russia, but in the US, I mean, we have doctors prescribe it for everything, from menstrual cramps to, acne, to girls who are like 13 years old, and they'll be on it for, most of their adolescence. And we just don't know what that does to brain development. And some of the stuff that's starting to come out suggests that it might actually be associated with a greater lifelong risk of developing major depressive disorder. And so it's something that we need more research on, and it's something that I think that people should be really cautious about.
So there is a good question about research here. What are the major challenges in research of hormonal regulation in women? I think it's about like scientific barriers, so on.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of challenges. Like, so studying women is harder than studying men. And the reason that it's harder to study us is because our hormones change cyclically. And the researchers feel like they need to account for that. Now, the irony of all of this is, and I do think that, really good, careful research should account for women's cyclical changing hormones. But the idea that research that's done on males or men is somehow more controlled or whatever, because their hormones don't change, we know isn't true, because men's and males' testosterone levels change all the time. And so, but it can be really challenging to study women, because our hormones do change. And if you want to look at the effects of, let's say, a medication on how a woman is feeling, it means that you have to measure her at different phases of her cycle, depending on what her sex hormones are doing. So that way you can determine that, you know, the way that she's feeling has to do with the medication and not with the different phase, wherever she is in her cycle. And so this means that research that's done on females or on women is tends to be more expensive and more time consuming than research that's done on men or on males. And because of this, a lot of researchers have shied away from studying women's issues, including things like the birth control pill.
Yeah, and maybe there are also some challenges like less funding for women because patriarchy.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about it, especially historically. You know, women weren't studied because people just didn't think that we were worth studying. You know, they just didn't think that we deserved the same attention that men and male issues receive. And, you know, thankfully, at least in the US, things have gotten better because there's a lot more women in science than there used to be. And now that we have more women in science, you know, we're able to say, put our foot down and say, no, these are important issues and we deserve to be studied, and we're going to understand these things. And so, you know, things have gotten better, but they're certainly not perfect. There's, you know, still a bias where men and men's related issues are still looked at a much greater frequency than our women's. And I'm hoping to see that in the next 50 years that we start to see that that continues to change for the better.
There is another question related to this one. Maria Voxen asks, just curious, do you educate men about women's hormones, and what is the share of male audience of your book readers?
Oh, that's really interesting. I don't know what the share of the male audience is. I'd be really curious to find that out. And I don't even know, I'd have to find out if my publisher even, like my publishers know that. That's like a fascinating question. But I think that it's so important for men and women to be educated about their own hormone levels and about the levels of the opposite sex. Like, I think it's a really smart thing to do. I think it helps you better understand your partner. And so I absolutely think that that's a smart idea. So I know in my own relationship that my relationship with my partner is a lot better because he understands what's happening with me cyclically, because I have and part of it is, you know, I study this stuff, and so I'm very in tune with what's happening biologically, but I am very, you know, I have predictable responses at certain points in my cycle where it's like, all right, this is the time when I'm really interested in sex, and this is the time where I'm really emotional and get angry easily, and I recognize it myself. And my partner, I'm able to communicate that with him. Like, I'm feeling prickly today because, you know, of where I am in my cycle, and it makes our relationship better because we're able to navigate all of that in a more effective way. So I think it's a very smart idea.
So when you've done some offline lectures that long time ago, did you see any males in the audience?
Yeah, back when the world was open.
Yeah.
Yeah. So gosh, let me think about that. I'd say that the proportion was probably 80-20 women to men.
Yeah.
But
that's not bad.
Yeah, no, not bad. I think that men are becoming, you know, a little bit more aware of the benefits that come from understanding their partners.
Here is another good question. Tanya asks if there is a valid connection between taking birth control and hormonal birth control and the increased risk of cancer.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a really great question. And so I'm just going to preface this by saying that that I'm not a medical doctor. And so this isn't my area of expertise. I've done a lot of reading on it, so I can tell you what I've read, but I don't know the literature firsthand the way that I understand the stuff in psychology and neuroscience. But the research seems to sort of unanimously agree that the birth control pill is associated with a decreased risk of ovarian cancer. So that's a pretty robust effect. And also, and this is really interesting, and nobody knows why, but a recent meta-analysis finds that the birth control pill also seems to be associated with a decreased risk of colorectal cancer. So like colon cancer.
Yeah.
And nobody understands why. And that's fascinating. And so, so there's some minimized risk there. And the research seems to suggest that there is a slight increased risk of breast cancer. So you get an increased risk of breast cancer, a decreased risk of colorectal and particularly ovarian cancer. And everything else that I've seen.
Endometrial cancer, I guess, also, if you have endometriosis.
Yes, yeah, no, that's another one. I've forgotten about that, but yes, no, you're absolutely right. And that one's a pretty robust effect too. That's like a pretty, you know, I feel really confident in that set of results too. So a lowered risk of endometrial cancer also, and yeah, and endometriosis for the exact same reasons, because what it does is it prevents your the cells in your uterus from proliferating. And one type of cell that loves to proliferate is cancer cells. And so when you prevent proliferation of cells in the uterus, that nips that right in the bud. So so that's the stuff that I know for certain. And like I said, I'm not a medical doctor. So I've just read probably the same things that you all have read.
So I think one, maybe two more questions. I've seen one about pregnancy, maybe something about that. Ksenia asks, in your book you wrote that getting pregnant is very complex for a future child, as uterus chooses which embryo should be further developed and attached to the uterus. Don't you think that getting pregnant with the help of IVF is not very good for evolution, as IVF gives an opportunity to bear a weak child?
This is such an interesting question. Okay, like, and I'm fascinated by this, by the way. So, you know, we do know that there, you know, like in terms of egg development and in terms of, you know, sperm and egg meeting with one another and the, you know, and implantation and all of this stuff, there's a lot of sort of vetting that goes on in the body, right? So like the sperm that's chosen by the egg to implant itself is actually chosen by the egg. So different sperm, you know, the one that gets there first is generally the one that's like, you know, the highest genetic quality. And the egg doesn't accept every sperm that arrives. Right, so the egg is actually making some decisions, and I say this in a way that makes it sound conscious, but obviously it's not. But so all of these things are these processes that evolution by selection has created to help facilitate the development of healthy children, and because of course those children would have been more likely to survive and then have, you know, and so on and so forth. And so IVF, where you take just a, you know, sort of a randomly chosen sperm that just has good motility. So the doctors are trying to sort of mirror these same processes, right? Like they're like, oh, well, this guy is really fast and furious, and so he's probably a healthy one. So doctors are trying to mimic in some ways with their brains, right, the process that goes on biologically. And so one would assume that this would have, you know, some level of, you know, that it would have some positive, like it would do better than if they just grabbed a random sperm, I guess is what I'm saying. But like, what does this mean? Like what I really want to see is a long-term longitudinal study of children who were conceived via IVF, and then children that were conceived in some other way, and tried to control for the sort of extraneous variables that are in the study to whatever extent possible, and just look at long-term health outcomes and longevity, because I'm so curious about this. And like, does it matter? Yeah. Right? Like, how much does that matter in terms of promoting survival and promoting reproductive success?
And mental health also.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so many different questions. It would be a really fascinating study to do a sort of overall, you know, how are these kids performing? And we could look at everything like cognitive performance, you know, mental health, physical health, longevity, and then see whether or not are there differences. How much does it matter that somebody was sort of conceived the old-fashioned way or is conceived via IVF? I don't know, and I would love to know.
Natalia here, I guess the same woman that asked about checking hormonal levels before prescribing the birth control pill, she says that she is a medical doctor, and she's specializing now in endocrinology in Boston University, and she is open to contact you, maybe to become an ambassador of Russian ways we do things here and check for hormones. So if you're interested, we will send you her contacts.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you.
Okay, so I think the time is up. Thank you very much to everyone. I'll give the floor to Anastasia.
Да, спасибо. Спасибо, Сара, спасибо, Дарья, за очень интересный разговор. К сожалению, мы не успели задать все вопросы, но они были очень интересные, и я постараюсь передать их просто доктору Хилл посмотреть, вот, чтобы она была в курсе, что ее спрашивает российская аудитория, и я надеюсь, что мы встретились не последний раз. В любом случае, большое вам спасибо за искренний интерес к сегодняшнему вебинару. И пришло время прощаться. Запись мы обработаем и пришлем в течение пары дней, поэтому можно будет ее пересмотреть. Буквально 2 минуты, чтобы все могли попрощаться, и мы тогда закончим сегодняшний вебинар. Доктор Хилл вас благодарят. Я думаю, вместе с Дарьей. Да, все верно.
Oh, thank you all. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you. This was fun.
Да, прошло супер, мне кажется. Тогда все, я думаю, что уже не будем сильно задерживаться. Всем еще раз большое спасибо. Доктор Хилл, Дарья, Дмитрий, наш переводчик. Вижу, что в комментарии улетает с благодарностью и ему. Тогда ждите запись и читайте книгу Сары. Там точно есть ответы на некоторые из вопросов, которые были у нас в чате. Тогда мы отключаемся.